One thing the thing I'm going to talk about today is the formation of national tradition and how that happened in the United States, and how we're starting to see with the craft beer revolution, this is developing in other countries as well. The most dramatic case, I think, is the United States, so that's what I want to talk about today. So what is national tradition? Beer is, unlike some other fermented beverages, which are products of terroir, like wine, it comes from the grapes and the earth. Beer is actually much more like cuisine. It's something that you construct. You apply heat, you use ingredients, and different processes, and all of those things mean you have enormous variability, beer to beer, and it gives the brewer an opportunity to do very different things. And when you look at the places where people have strong beer traditions, you see that the beers are very different. Belgian beer is different than German beer, even though the basic building blocks of beer are fairly similar. The beers can be quite different. And an example that I often give is France and Germany are right next to each other, and they have the same kind of agricultural region. They can grow the same kind of vegetables. They have cows, they have pigs, and yet their cuisine is very different. So, you know, Kokovan and Schweinhaxen are like radically different things, and they reflect the way people think about food in those two countries. Thanks. The things that go into creating national tradition, when you look at how these things come together, are things like ingredients in agriculture. So in some countries, the hops taste different, the barley tastes different, the malts are processed differently. They have different history, and in a minute I'm going to give some examples of national tradition, and the Czech Republic is a good example of how history can really shape that. Laws and taxes are something people overlook, but they're incredibly important. Depending on what your country allows you to put in beer, that shapes what kind of beer you have. The most famous is Reinheitsgebot, which dictates that there are just 4 ingredients in German beer, which means that they don't have sugar and they don't have spices, but it also means that they can't do certain things like add carbon dioxide to their beer unless it's produced naturally through the process of fermentation, because that would be another ingredient. So it really shapes the way the Germans think about and brew beer. War and famine have always really inflected the way beer develops, and you know, World War II had this massive effect across the globe and changed beer radically. The beer that was brewed before the World Wars looked a lot different than the beer that survived afterwards. Local drinking habits are really important. In Belgium, people like to drink beer with food, and they drink a little bit stronger beer. They drink beer that's more expressive in its yeast character, and they drink it in smaller doses, so it's much stronger. But in Germany and Czech Republic and England, they have a pub culture, and you don't go out for a beer, you go out for many beers. So the beer has to be very sessionable, and it has to be tasty on the first drink and also survive and be tasty after your 3rd or 4th pint. So all those things shape it. And then just local preferences, which is kind of that ineffable thing. The United States likes really hoppy beers, and Belgians like yeasty beers, and it's kind of impossible to know how that stuff happens, but it does really affect the way that beer develops. Okay. Some quick examples just to point this out. English cask ale. This is a picture from the Sam Smith's brewery. They still actually they actually use wooden casks. English cask ale is this weird beer that nobody would ever invent now because it's incredibly hard to make. You have to do this process. The brewing process is actually quite easy, but then the casking process, keeping it fresh, getting it to the cellar, having a cellarman on hand who takes care of it, serving it quickly enough so that it doesn't go sour, all so that it has this presentation in the pub of this lightly carbonated, very smooth, soft beer that's great to drink in many pints. All of that stuff is a product of culture, not design. Let's go to the next one. In Belgium, one of the most interesting things about Belgian beer is it's very yeast-driven, the character, and it goes through a secondary, they're so interested in the flavor of yeast that it goes through a secondary fermentation in the bottle. So nearly every brewery that you go to in Belgium will have a warm room where beer is in the bottle going through a secondary fermentation. It's incredibly important to that national tradition. It's like a big hallmark. Okay, the next one. And then finally, those are all pretty ancient traditions. You can find them going back hundreds of years. The most recent example of the emerging national tradition we have is from the Czech Republic, and probably it's one of the more famous examples in beer. Josef Groll was a Bavarian who came to the Czech Republic, and looking at English malting techniques, he was a malter himself, and looking at English malting techniques, he figured out a way to malt his barley very, very pale. So when he created Svetlé pivo, means pale beer, he invented this new kind of beer that pretty soon everybody really loved, and it spawned this whole tradition of brewing, and now we have Pilsners all over the world. The Czech Republic went through this long period in the 20th century where they were occupied by first the Germans and then the Soviets, and it sort of froze their brewing tradition in a way from before World War II until the 1990s. And so now you see when you go there, they still have some of these old brewing traditions like decoction mashing, which are characteristic of the Czech tradition that you don't find anywhere else, which is pretty fascinating. All right. Yeah, the next one. Now we're going to talk about the American tradition and how this developed. Hops, so the American tradition, what I'm talking about here is IPAs, principally. I have something like that. And Americans use hops in a really radically different way now than anybody else has used hops in the past. So just a little primer on hops, and I'll try to compress this as much as possible. Originally, beer was nobody used hops. For thousands of years, it was made without hops, sometimes without spices, but hops came in, the first use was by monks in around 800 or 900, and then it kind of went away until 1200. Let's go to the next one. When in 1200, the Hanseatic League city of Bremen was using hops in its beer, and it was shipping these hoppy beers around Holland, the Baltics, and Scandinavia. And an interesting thing happened, and this is one of the watershed moments in all brewing history. The beer that they put it in barrels, they put it in wooden barrels and shipped it, scores or hundreds of miles. It would arrive in, let's say Holland or Tallinn, and it would go to the pub, and the publican would tap the keg or the cask, and it would stay fresh longer than the local beer. So beer that traveled all the way from Bremen might last 2 or 3 weeks, and local beer was going sour much quicker than that. And it's because we now know hops are an antimicrobial, and it was kind of this killer app that that Bremen had figured out that allowed beer to stay fresh longer. Let's go to the next slide. Over the next few hundred years, hops ultimately supplanted all other spices in beer. And it doesn't look like something that would be common because that you would expect to see naturally, because before the use of hops, you didn't have to boil beer. In order to isomerize the hops, you need to boil it. And boiling, when you think about it, boiling is really expensive. You have to have wood, you have to sit there for an hour, the brewing process is longer, the whole thing is more expensive. And everybody thought the beer tasted weird. Hops were not, gruit, the spice mixture that they used before, was very sweet and pleasant, and hops seemed kind of weedy and unpleasant. You read accounts from the time particularly in Britain, people were not into hops. They didn't like the flavor at all. But what did hops have going for them? They had this antimicrobial characteristic that was incredibly important in it, and in a period of time before we understood biochemistry, it helped take care of some of the early bacteria that were forming. Let's go to the next slide. And so this created a process of brewing that lasted for 800 years. That process was one in which you put a lot of hops in at the start of the boil, or at least you put in however many hops you're going to put in, you put in the majority at the start of the boil. And the reason you did that is because the whole point was not the flavor, it was the antimicrobial action. So even if a beer style wasn't particularly bitter in flavor, you still wanted to put most of the hops at the front of the boil because the whole point is this antimicrobial characteristic. That was, as I say, the central purpose of hopping for the better part of 800 years. So, fast forward from 1200 in Bremen all the way to 1995, let's say, in the United States. Yesterday I talked a little bit about American hops and how it took Americans a long time to get away from avoiding the strong assertive flavors of their hops to embracing them. And in the mid-1990s they started to do that. But of course, they made beer the way everybody made beer. They put a ton of hops in at the start of the boil, extract the bitterness, and the first IPAs that appeared in the 1990s were extraordinarily bitter. And there was a little minor thing. They were not the most popular beers, but among the people who liked them, this arms race for how bitter they could become got launched. And those beers actually were really terrible. And when you taste ones that were made that way now, you can't believe we ever drank them. They were just tinctures of hop bitterness, and they were really unpleasant. Let's go to the next one. So this went on for maybe a decade, and then slowly, people started realizing that the aroma, those wonderful citrusy and mango and all that stuff was super, that's where these things really shined, was when you had these lovely qualities in modern American IPAs that we love. So brewers started to do everything they could to maximize those characteristics, which meant moving, for the first time in brewing history, moving the use of the boiling hops to later in the boil, because the later you put it in the boil, the essential hop elements are more preserved and remain intact, so the volatile aromatics and the flavors of pine and citrus and mango and all that stuff survive, which they do not do when you put them in the first part of the boil. Next one. And so we come to this place where, for the first time, Americans are brewing with gigantic amounts of hops, but they're putting them really late in the boil, and in some cases they're not even using hops at the start of the boil at all. I'm going to do a little slight plug here. I just released a book, and it's about brewing, and I talked to this guy, Ben Edmonds, about this process that he uses, and this is the American brewers is so recent that it hasn't really become standardized yet, but his process was so mind-blowing that I included in the book as one example of ways to think about beer, and we'll just go through this very quickly. Historically, you would have looked at your alpha acid amount and you would have decided how many hops to put in the bitter charge at the start of the boil to get an IBU amount that you want. You would pay very little attention to later additions that you would add because they would extract less and less alpha acids, and you wouldn't really pay any attention to those. So the big calculation always was, how big is your bitter charge? But when you're starting to use these very expressive hops to get flavors and aromas, you're much more concerned with what happens in the flavor and aroma additions. So Ben flips this on its head, and he doesn't even think about IBUs at all. He doesn't even look at the package to see how many alpha acids are in his hops. He always uses, this is how he makes, Breakside makes a ton of different IPAs, from session IPAs to triple IPAs. And no matter what kind of beer he's making, if it's a triple, he may tinker with these amounts slightly. as opposed to a session IPA. But roughly all of his beers, he starts with the Whirlpool edition. The Whirlpool edition is after you do the boil, the hops go to a vessel, which was traditionally where the wort was spun and the trub and hop matter formed a cone. It was a way to separate the particulates from your wort, but American craft brewers started using that as a way to infuse, like a tea, hop flavor and aroma into wort that was just starting to cool. So Ben starts there, and he always uses 1.5 pounds per barrel of hops in that edition. So let's say he's got a 10, if you're using a 10-barrel system, that would be like 15 pounds of hops. Boom, put them in there. Then he thinks about, he moves backwards. Instead of moving forward in time, he's moving backward in time. And now he's thinking, 10 minutes before the end of boil, how much do I put? And he uses a pound per barrel, so another 10 pounds of hops he would add at the 10-minute point. At that point, he will calculate the IBUs and look and see how many IBUs are in the beer, and he'll shore up the final amount by adding maybe 5 or 7 IBUs in the bitter charge. And the entire reason he does that is not because he cares about adding bitterness to his beer, but because for kettle performance, to stop the boil over. The hops help in that process. So basically, when Ben is making an IPA, he's thinking entirely about late edition hops. Once he gets to dry hopping, he does up to 3 infusions with 1.5 pounds per barrel again, so 15 more pounds of hops, maybe 3 times for 45 pounds. So now we're looking at something like 45, 55, 70 pounds of hops in one 10-barrel batch of beer, and almost none of it is going at the front of the boil. So this is like when you think about the history of brewing, this is a radical change from having all your hops go at the start of the boil to almost none of them go to the start of the boil. And this is now the characteristic way all Americans make their IPAs. All right, next one. Since I'm running out of time, we'll just mention these quickly. This has led to a whole bunch of discoveries about the way beer functions. So we now know that oxidative compounds in hops called humulinones actually contribute a little bit of bitterness. It was never really something people thought about because it was such a small amount relative to the amount of bitterness that was in a beer. The humulinones comes from late edition hops. It was such a small amount that people never paid attention to it until Americans started using these gigantic quantities of hops, and it turns out you get a lot of bitterness from these oxidative elements. So the bitterness is actually pretty high, even if you only add hops later in the addition. Biotransformation, we just heard John Palmer talk about what happens during maturation and dry hopping. Well, it turns out that there's, when yeast and hop oils are together, they continue to do some biochemistry. They change the flavors and aromas that you find in those hop oils. We don't actually know anything about it. It's too early. Nobody's done any research on that, so that's just out there waiting to be discovered. And in steeping temperatures, this is another interesting thing that Ben is doing. He just built a brand new brewery for Breakside, and 5 minutes. Whew, I'm gonna make it. At that stage, the Whirlpool stage, they had, at Breakside, they begin to discover that when it comes out of the kettle at 100 C, it's a little bit too hot. So they installed a heat exchanger in between the kettle and the Whirlpool so they can lower that temperature. And I'm not gonna do so good on the C, but maybe to like 90 degrees. Because they believe that the infusion that you get at 90 degrees in the Whirlpool gives a more richer quality of the flavors and aromas that come from the hops. Again, very little is known about that, and they have to experiment. Is it really 90? Is it 88? Is it 92? Is it the same for every hop type? They don't know. So all of these things are now being like pushed around in a way that nobody's ever thought about beer. All right. So that's sort of the most recent. We went from 1842, when the last national tradition happened, to maybe 2005. We went through this giant gap where people were not inventing new beer styles or new brewing traditions. But now, all of a sudden, there's craft beer everywhere, and we're starting to see the emergence of other national traditions. In Japan, old sake breweries are starting to brew, and they're using sake yeast. Japanese craft brewers are tinkering with that and experimenting on what it looks like to make Japanese beer. In Scandinavia, they're talking about new Nordic beer. What does that look like? They're using the same things that Noma and other restaurants there, that same kind of approach. So they're doing some foraging, and they're thinking about what does native yeast contribute. Scandinavia has a long tradition of farmhouse ales, which is returning, and there's some thought that maybe these are going to become a more popular mainstream style. And I added here at the very last one, I've been talking to Mexican brewers, and already there's some discussion of what does native Mexican beer look like? Is it something that's made with chilies? Is it something with native yeast? Maybe some kind of locally grown hops people are thinking of experimenting with. All these things are potentials for the future, and in the next 50 years or so, we may be able to do a presentation where we talk not about the new American tradition, but the new Mexican tradition or the new Japanese tradition or anything like that. So, last scene, I will leave you with this. I just released a new book, and of course, you should all go buy that. Thank you.